The hearing room had all the tension of a pressure cooker about to burst. Cameras lined the wood-paneled walls like vultures awaiting a collapse. It was the final day of testimony for the Justice in Crisis Senate hearing, an ostensibly bipartisan investigation into prosecutorial overreach and racial disparities in sentencing. But it had become something else entirely. A stage for ideological sparring, a crucible where reputations could be forged or destroyed. Senator John Neely Kennedy, with his down-home drawl and folksy sarcasm, had been laying rhetorical traps all morning. When it was Representative Jasmine Crockett's turn to testify, he smiled like a man watching a lamb trot into a lion's den. She sat poised in her slate-gray blazer, legal pad at her side, her eyes fixed on the dais with unblinking intensity. "Congresswoman Crockett," Kennedy began, leaning back theatrically in his leather chair, "you claim to understand the complexities of federal sentencing guidelines. That's mighty bold. Tell us then, what's the distinction between a BARA 924C and a FARA 922G offense?" A few Republican aides chuckled. Crockett did not blink. She folded her hands. "Do you want the statutory language or the practical implications for disproportionately impacted black communities?" The senator grinned like a snake oil salesman. "Oh, give us the lawyerly stuff, ma'am. Impress us." He bit into the word ma'am like it tasted bitter. Kennedy wasn't expecting her to oblige, but she did. Calmly, precisely. Crockett outlined the legal framework for both statutes, citing U.S. v. O'Brien and the impact of consecutive mandatory minimums. She invoked sentencing disparities in the Fifth Circuit, the historical context of legislative intent, and the role of prosecutorial discretion. The laughter stopped. Kennedy raised an eyebrow, suddenly unsure whether he had just poked a bear or summoned a storm. But the performative contempt returned quickly. "Well," he said, "you've clearly done your homework, or someone did it for you." There it was. The smirk, the insinuation, the old weapon of American politics, discredit the brilliance of a black woman by framing it as borrowed. Crockett's jaw tensed, but she said nothing, not a twitch, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't passive, but commanding. The air grew taut. A few senators shuffled uncomfortably. Kennedy's voice, which moments ago had swaggered through the chamber, now sounded tinny. "You don't have a response?" he pressed, a nervous chuckle escaping. "I'd think a Harvard-educated lawyer—" "Oh, wait, that's not you, is it?" Crockett finally blinked. She tilted her head, studied him like a surgeon might study a tumor, and slowly pushed her microphone away. The silence deepened. What followed wasn't a sound, but a presence, her refusal to engage becoming the loudest voice in the room. A stillness that hummed with rejection, resistance, and revolt. Crockett sat there as Kennedy flailed. "This is a hearing," he barked. "You're obligated to respond." But Crockett's refusal was surgical. She turned slightly, letting her eyes sweep over the room, capturing each senator, each aide, each blinking camera. She wasn't silenced. She was choosing silence as an indictment. It was no longer about Kennedy. It was about everything he represented. An aide leaned toward Kennedy, whispering urgently, but he waved the man off. "If you won't speak, we'll assume you don't have anything to say." A low murmur erupted from the press gallery, followed by a rising stir from the public seats. Senator Cory Booker leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Senator Hirono whispered to a staffer. Even Josh Hawley looked sideways, sensing something tectonic had shifted. Crockett finally leaned into the mic, but only to say, "Let the record show that my silence is not due to ignorance but exhaustion." She stood. Exhaustion with this performative disrespect, with the theater of false doubt, with being invited here not as a colleague, but as a caricature you intend to mock. The room erupted, not in applause, but in the sound of chairs, shifting, hearts racing, truths dropping like anvils. Outside, the footage was clipped, shared, dissected. The silence became a weapon, replayed across networks and timelines. TikTok dubbed it the Crockett Freeze, an act of political aikido, where an attempted insult was turned into a national moment. CNN looped it under the banner, legal expertise, political cynicism. Fox tried to spin it, but even Laura Ingraham hesitated. Her viewers saw something unsettling, not rage, but composure that couldn't be unraveled. Inside the Capitol, the Republican whip's office went into damage. Control. You poked the wrong fire, one aide told Kennedy off camera. You thought she'd snap. She chose not to bleed for you. The Congressional Black Caucus released a statement praising Crockett's strategic refusal to validate condescension. A New York Times op-ed titled, "The Power of a Black Woman's Silence" went viral. Jasmine Crockett gave no interviews. She didn't tweet. She didn't retweet. But on the floor of the House the next day, she introduced the Dignity in Oversight Act, which would formally censure the use of racialized dog whistles in committee hearings. It wasn't expected to pass. But it wasn't about passage. It was a signal, a reckoning, a reminder that silence can be legislative too. The final twist came not in a headline or vote tally, but in a leaked email from Kennedy to his communications director. Find me a way out of this. We underestimated her. The leak, authenticated by 3 independent outlets, sparked further outrage. It revealed Kennedy's awareness, not just of his misstep, but of her mastery. On Meet the Press, Crockett finally broke her silence, just for a moment. They didn't underestimate me, she said quietly. They overestimated the safety of mocking someone who remembers what injustice tastes like. Then she stood again. But this time she didn't walk out alone. A group of first-year Congresswomen, Black, Latina, Asian, Indigenous, stood with her. None of them spoke. None of them had to. It was a choreography of dissent, a movement born not of shouting, but of restraint. As they disappeared behind the chamber doors, John Neely Kennedy sat alone at the witness table, staring at the microphone in front of him like it was something that could bite. For once, the folksy senator had nothing to say the next morning. The Capitol buzzed like a shaken beehive. Staffers passed each other in hallways, whispering her name like a spell. Crockett. The silence wasn't fading. It was metastasizing, growing teeth, infiltrating committee agendas, strategy memos, donor calls. In the White House press room, a journalist asked whether the president had seen the clip. Yes, Karine Jean-Pierre replied simply, and he believes dignity is sometimes loudest when unspoken. The moment had breached partisan lines in odd, destabilizing ways. A libertarian op-ed on Reason.com argued that Crockett's silence was the most powerful act of protest since Edward Snowden's leaks. An exasperated Kennedy tried to shift the narrative during a Fox Business segment. I've debated Harvard, grads, Yale scholars, hell, even Barack Obama back in the day. I wasn't mocking her, I was challenging her. But the words rang hollow, defensive. Tucker Carlson, now hosting his show on a private platform, chuckled and said, Crockett didn't just survive Kennedy. She devoured him slowly without opening her mouth. Even his supporters weren't laughing anymore. What Crockett had unleashed wasn't a viral moment. It was a movement rethinking how black women wield presence, how brilliance and restraint can eclipse belligerence. Meanwhile, inside Crockett's office, the air was eerily calm. You know they want a follow-up, said her chief of staff, Terrence. Op-eds, Sunday shows, a speech. They want you to speak into the moment. She looked up from her notes on judicial review. That's what they want. That's not what's needed. She paused. They want another angry black woman clip they can control. Terrence sighed. Then what do we give them? Crockett smiled faintly. The truth. But on my time, she'd become a political paradox, louder in silence, untouchable, in stillness. Invitations flooded her inbox. MSNBC panels, The View, even Real Time with Bill Maher. She declined them all. Her silence was more valuable than any soundbite. In private meetings, however, her voice was sharp, surgical. She demanded Democratic leadership back the Dignity and Oversight Act, not for passage, but for precedent. Let them vote against it, she told Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Let history record their discomfort. Rumors swirled that she might be considering a Senate run. Texas Democrats were ecstatic. Strategists smelled a wave, but Crockett said nothing publicly. Her muteness had become a tactic, a shield, a scalpel, and the entire political class couldn't stop bleeding from it. The next confrontation came, not from Kennedy, but from Senator Marsha Blackburn, who, emboldened by Kennedy's floundering attempt, tried to ambush Crockett during a judiciary roundtable. I find it fascinating, Blackburn began, that the Congresswoman who refused to answer questions under oath now expects her bill to be taken seriously. The cameras perked up. Crockett slowly turned to her. Senator, she said, coolly, if you believe silence during racial provocation disqualifies one's legislation, then I suggest you revisit your own record on January 6th. Gasps rippled across the room. Blackburn stammered. Those are completely different contexts. No, Crockett replied, her voice calm, firm, irrefutable. They're both about cowardice. The only difference is that mine was strategic. She stood again. She had turned her silences into spotlights, her exits into entrances. A pattern emerged. When confronted, she said just enough to sting, then let the vacuum pull the truth.